She was supposed to be the one going to London, but I made sure she never would.
Amara said it the way some people say grace before a meal, quietly, without guilt, like it was simply the natural order of things. She was standing in front of the mirror in her sister's bedroom, wearing Zola's good coat, the one their mother had bought with 3 months of savings, holding a passport that had Zola's name on it but would soon carry her own ambitions inside it. She was not shaking. That was the thing about Amara, she never shook. But let us go back, because a theft this precise does not happen overnight. And you need to understand the two women at the center of this story before you can truly understand what was lost and what was taken. Zola Dlamini was 31 years old and had been tired for approximately 10 of those years, the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from building something real with your bare hands. She had grown up in Khayelitsha, Cape Town, in a house where the roof argued with the rain every winter and the electricity went on strike twice a month. But her mother, Mama Grace, had raised both girls with one unshakable rule, which was that education was the one thing no one could repossess. Zola had listened. Amara had taken notes on how to look like she was listening. By 31, Zola was a qualified nurse working double shifts at Groote Schuur Hospital, the kind of nurse that patients asked for by name, the kind that remembered which elderly man liked his tea without sugar and which teenage boy needed someone to sit with him when the pain medication wore off at 2 a.m. Her colleagues called her Sis Zola, with the kind of warmth that cannot be performed, and her hands, always moving, always checking, always straightening something, were the hands of a woman who had decided that caring for people was not just her job, but her entire argument against a world that had not always been kind to her. She had applied for the UK skilled worker visa 4 times. 4 times, she had gathered her documents, paid the fees, written the supporting letters, and waited, and been declined for reasons that ranged from insufficient ties to home country, to one rejection that was so vague she read it 3 times and still could not find the actual reason inside it. Each time, she had cried exactly once, gone to bed, woken up the next morning, and started the next application. The 5th time, a Johannesburg-born businessman named Kwame Asani had seen her name on a list of skilled healthcare workers being considered for sponsored placements at a private medical group he had invested in, based in London. He had reviewed her file personally, not because he made a habit of that, but because his assistant had flagged her 4 previous attempts as remarkable, and Kwame had not built his empire by ignoring remarkable things. He had approved the sponsorship on a Tuesday afternoon. Zola had received the email on a Wednesday morning, and she had sat in the hospital break room and read it 6 times before she allowed herself to believe it. Then she had gone to the bathroom, cried for 4 minutes, washed her face, and returned to her shift because there was a patient in bed 7 who needed her, and London would still be there after the afternoon rounds. That evening, Mama Grace had made umkusho, which was Zola's favorite, and the whole family had crowded into the small sitting room and celebrated with the particular joy of people who know exactly how much something costs to earn. Amara had smiled the entire evening. It was a very good smile. She had been practicing it for years. Amara Dlamini was 27 years old and had always been the one people looked at first when they walked into a room, which she had mistaken, for most of her life, for being the one people valued most. She was beautiful in the way that stops conversations, long-legged and sharp-eyed, with a laugh that arrived before she did, and an opinion on everything delivered with such confidence that people often agreed with her before they had finished thinking. She had started 2 businesses, a hair-braiding salon and an online boutique, and had abandoned both at exactly the moment they required consistency rather than charisma. She had dated 3 men with money, left all of them when the relationship began to ask something of her, and had spent the last year living in Zola's apartment in Observatory while she figured things out, which in practice meant sleeping until 10, borrowing Zola's moisturizer without asking, and watching her older sister leave for double shifts at 5 in the morning with a mixture of pity and envy she had never once examined closely enough to understand. She did not hate Zola. That is important. She loved her sister the way some people love a mirror that only shows their flaws, with a complicated resentment that had nothing to do with Zola and everything to do with who Amara saw when she stood next to her. When the visa approval came, something shifted in Amara's chest, small and precise, like a key turning. She had watched her mother stroke Zola's face with both hands at the celebration dinner, and something in her had gone very quiet and very cold, and in that cold, quiet place, a plan had begun to arrange itself. She moved fast because she had always been good at the things that required nerve rather than patience. First, she photographed every page of Zola's passport and visa documents while Zola was on a night shift, spreading them on the kitchen counter under the phone flashlight with the steady hands of someone who had already decided that guilt was a problem for later. Then she called a man named Saifo, who was not a friend exactly, but was the kind of person who knew people, specifically a home affairs clerk in the Belleville office who had a gambling problem and a very negotiable sense of professional ethics. It cost her 40,000 rand, which was every cent of the money she had borrowed from their cousin Tabo 6 months ago for business investment, and which Tabo would not see again for a very long time. Within a week, she had a duplicate travel file, her own photo attached to Zola's approved visa reference, with paperwork that would survive a basic check at the departure gate if no one looked too carefully. And people at departure gates rarely looked too carefully when a woman was beautiful and confident and moved like she belonged exactly where she was going. The night before Zola's flight, Amara made tea. She made it the way Zola liked it, strong, 1 sugar, with the good rooibos from the tin on the second shelf, and she carried it to her sister's room while Zola was packing, and she sat on the edge of the bed and chatted about nothing, about a dress she had seen online, about the neighbor's dog, about anything, while her sister drank the tea without looking up from her suitcase. The sleeping tablets she had ground into the tea were the mild kind, she had told herself, as though the mildness of the tablets changed the nature of what she was doing. Zola was asleep within the hour. By midnight she was deeply, unreachably unconscious. Amara worked quickly. She took the passport, the visa documents, the sponsorship letter, the envelope from Kwame's legal team with the accommodation details, and the airport pickup information, the good coat from the hook behind the door, and the small gold earrings their mother had given Zola for the journey, because Amara had always wanted those earrings anyway. She left a note on the kitchen counter that said simply, "I had to go," which was so vague it could have meant anything, and had the additional advantage of being technically true. She was at the airport by 4 a.m. She checked in as Zola Dlamini, nurse, traveling to London on a sponsored work visa, and she did not shake once, not at the check-in desk, not at passport control, not at the boarding gate. She had a talent for performing the person she needed to be, and right now she needed to be a woman with every right in the world to board this plane, so that was exactly what she was. Kwame Asante was waiting at arrivals in a charcoal suit with a driver beside him holding a card that said Dlamini, and when Amara walked through those doors with her sister's coat and her own extraordinary nerve, he looked up, and something in his expression shifted, not unprofessionally. He was far too controlled for that, but enough. She was not what the file photograph had suggested, but then file photographs never told the whole story. "Zola Dlamini," Amara said, extending her hand, and she said her sister's name the way an actress says the first line of a play, with complete commitment, so that the audience forgets there is a stage at all. "Kwame Asante," he said, and his handshake was firm, and his eyes were the kind that noticed things, though Amara, who had spent her life charming people who noticed things, was not worried about that yet. She should have been. Back in Cape Town, Zola woke up at 9 a.m. with a headache that sat behind her eyes like a tenant who had stopped paying rent, and a confusion so thick it took her several minutes to understand why the room felt wrong. Then she saw the empty hook behind the door, and the open drawer where her documents had been, and the note on the kitchen counter. And understanding arrived not like a wave, but like a wall, all at once, solid and total. She called Amara's phone 14 times. It rang out every time. She went to the police station in her house slippers because she had not stopped to think about shoes, and the officer at the front desk listened to her story with the expression of a man who had already decided what category to file it under before she finished talking, which was the category of family drama that would resolve itself. Her visa sponsor was notified of irregularities when Amara used the reference number at the London end. The file flagged. The original visa application was frozen pending investigation. Zola's name was now attached to a fraud report. She lost her job at Grootsure 2 weeks later, not with cruelty, but with paperwork, and paperwork is its own kind of cruelty. She went home to Mama Grace, who said nothing when Zola walked through the door, just opened her arms, and Zola stood in them for a long time while the Cape Town winter pressed against the windows, and both women understood without saying it that Amara had not just taken a passport. She had taken 5 years of rejected applications, double shifts, 4-minute cry breaks in hospital bathrooms, and one Tuesday afternoon approval email that Zola had read 6 times before she believed it. In London, Amara was drinking champagne in a Canary Wharf restaurant while Kwame told her about his investment portfolio, and she was nodding at the right moments and laughing at the right moments, because she was very good at right moments, and the life she had always believed she deserved was finally, deliciously, arriving exactly on schedule. She took one photo that evening of the skyline through the restaurant window, just the skyline, no face, no context, posted it with no caption to an account she had created 2 days before the flight. Old contacts would not find it. Zola's friends would not find it. She had been so careful. Except that on her wrist, just visible at the edge of the frame where her sleeve had slipped back when she held the phone up, was a small crescent scar, a burn from a steam iron when Amara was 9 years old. An accident. Zola had bandaged herself in their childhood kitchen while their mother was at work. 3 weeks later, Kwame took Amara to dinner at the same restaurant, and over dessert he slid a ring across the table, and Amara looked at it with an expression that was almost entirely real joy, and said yes before the word was fully formed. At the same moment, 11 hours ahead and an entire ocean away, Zola was lying on her mother's couch at 1 a.m., phone in hand, running the kind of obsessive search that grief and fury together produce. And she found the account, and she found the photo, and she enlarged it, and she saw the scar. She did not cry. She did not shout. She sat up slowly, put her feet on the floor, and looked at the screen for a long time with the expression of a woman reorganizing everything she knew about what came next. Then, quietly, to no one in the room, she said it. She forgot I know every inch of her. Kwame Asante sat across the candlelit table from the woman he had called his fiancée for 3 weeks, and he slid a white envelope across the linen tablecloth with the same calm energy a man might use to pass the salt, and he said, "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly who you are not." Amara looked at the envelope, then at his face, and for the first time in her life, her smile did not know what to do with itself. But let us go back 2 weeks, because Kwame Asante had not built 4 companies across 3 continents by being the kind of man who reacted before he understood. And what happened in those 2 weeks is the part of this story that Amara would replay in her head for the rest of her life, wondering exactly which moment had been the one that finished her. The anonymous email had arrived on a Thursday morning, routed through his company address, marked simply regarding Zola Dlamini, with 4 attachments, a copy of the original visa application with Zola's real photograph, a screenshot of the Home Office fraud flag on the reference number, a copy of Zola's nursing credentials from Groot Shore Hospital, and a single line of text that read, "The woman in your home is not her." Kwame read it twice, forwarded it to no one, closed his laptop, and walked to the window of his Canary Wharf office, and stood there for a while looking at the Thames, which had seen enough of human nature over the centuries to offer no particular judgment on this one. Then he picked up his phone and called a man named Douglas, who ran a private investigation firm out of Mayfair, and whose most important quality was that he did not ask questions that were not strictly necessary for the job. "I need verification on a person in my home," Kwame said, and Douglas, who had heard stranger opening lines, simply asked for a photograph and a starting point. Zola had found Douglas's firm through her childhood friend Naledi, who had studied immigration law in Pretoria and was now practicing in Johannesburg, and who had listened to the whole story on a video call without interrupting once, which told you everything about the quality of Naledi's legal training and also about how extraordinary the story was. "We filed a formal complaint with the Home Office first," Naledi had said, tapping her pen on her desk with the focused energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed dismantling injustice on behalf of people she loved. "And then we send everything to his business email, because if this man is who you say he is, he will do the rest himself." "You think he will believe it?" Zola had asked, sitting on her mother's couch in yesterday's clothes, hollow-eyed and still. Naledi had looked at her through the screen with the expression of a woman who had spent 5 years in courtrooms. "I think a man who sponsored a stranger's visa based on professional merit alone is not the kind of man who ignores documentation. Send it." Zola had sent it on a Wednesday night, sitting at the kitchen table while Mama Grace slept, and then she had put the phone face down and gone to make tea, because there was nothing left to do but wait, and waiting required tea. Douglas returned to Kwame on a Monday with a folder, a thin one, because the truth, once found, tends to be concise. Kwame sat at his desk and opened it, and looked at Zola's real photograph for a long time, a serious face, direct eyes, the particular expression of someone who had learned that the camera was not owed a performance. And then he looked at her credentials, 5 years at Groot Shore, a commendation from her department head, for visa applications before the one that had finally succeeded, and the fraud report that had been filed against her own name through no action of her own. He closed the folder. He went home that evening and made no indication, none, that anything had changed, which was one of the most disciplined performances of his adult life. And Kwame Asani was not a man who performed often, which made the performance all the more precise when he chose to deploy it. He watched her for 2 weeks. He asked her, over breakfast one morning, what the name of her ward supervisor had been at the hospital, casually, the way people ask about childhood teachers, and she said a name that Douglas had already confirmed did not exist in Groot Shore's records. And she said it with such complete confidence that Kwame actually paused to appreciate the specific quality of her audacity before he moved on to the next question about eggs. He asked her about a procedure, something clinical, something a nurse with 5 years of experience would answer without thinking, and she laughed and said she preferred not to talk about work on weekends, which was smooth enough that a different man might have accepted it. But Kwame had not gotten to where he was by accepting smooth answers. He asked her, one evening when they were watching television, about her mother's name, and she said Grace without hesitating, because it was true, Grace was her mother's name too, and he noted that, because it told him that the woman on his couch was not a stranger to Zola's life. She was family, which made everything considerably more complicated and also considerably worse. He made exactly one phone call to Cape Town, to Groot Shore Hospital, asking for records verification under the pretense of updating his sponsorship file, and a very helpful administrator named Patricia confirmed Zola Dlamini's employment history, her commendation, her departure under fraud investigation circumstances, and the fact that the fraud had been filed against her, not by her. And Patricia said it with the particular indignation of someone who had liked Zola very much and had not forgotten what had been done to her. Kwame thanked Patricia, hung up, and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds, which was the longest he had ever allowed himself to feel something before deciding what to do with it. Then he called Douglas again, and then he called his lawyer, and then he called the restaurant. He flew Zola to London on a Friday, business class, because he was precise about details, and the details of this particular situation demanded it, and he sent the itinerary to Naladi's email with a single message that read, "Please tell her to bring her original documents and to wear something she feels like herself in, not something she thinks London expects." Naladi had read that message aloud to Zola, sitting across the kitchen table from her, and Zola had looked at it for a moment and then said, "He has very specific instructions for someone who has never met me." And Naladi had said, "That is exactly why you should go." And that was the end of the discussion. Zola wore a deep green dress that Mama Grace had pressed carefully the night before, and the small gold earrings that had been a gift from an aunt 3 Christmases ago. Not the ones Amara had taken, different ones, because those were gone and Zola had decided some time ago to stop measuring what she had against what had been stolen. She landed at Heathrow on a Saturday morning, and a driver met her with a card that said Dlamini, and she looked at it for a second with an expression that was complicated and then got in the car, because she had not come this far to stand in an airport having feelings about cardboard signs. The restaurant was called Alara, which was close enough to Amara's name that Kwame had chosen it with a very quiet, very private sense of humor that Douglas, who was also present that evening in a corner booth with 2 colleagues, did not find particularly funny but professionally appreciated. Amara had spent the entire afternoon getting ready, which was the most honest thing she had done in months, because she genuinely wanted to look extraordinary for her engagement dinner, and she did a white silk gown, the kind that made a room aware of your arrival, her hair pulled back in a way that showed the earrings she was wearing, which were Zola's earrings, the gold ones from the hook behind the door, still on her wrist, still carrying that scar she had forgotten to think about. Kwame's friends and business associates were already seated when she arrived. 12 people arranged around a long table with candles and flowers and champagne already poured, and Amara walked in and felt the room respond to her the way rooms always had, and she smiled the smile she had spent 27 years perfecting, and thought, "This is it, this is the life I always knew was mine." Kwame was standing at the head of the table, and he smiled at her, and the smile was perfect, which should have told her something, because Kwame's real smiles always reached his eyes, and this one stopped at his mouth with the precision of a man who had rehearsed its exact dimensions. A photographer moved through the room, clicking quietly, and Amara assumed it was for the engagement announcement, and she posed slightly without appearing to pose, because she was talented at that, and the photographer captured her beautifully, the white gown, the champagne flute, the stolen earrings, the scar on her wrist, all of it, documented with excellent lighting. Kwame raised his glass. The room went quiet. And then the door opened. Zola Dlamini walked into the restaurant in a deep green dress with her documents in a folder under her arm and the expression of a woman who had rehearsed exactly nothing because she had decided that whatever happened next was simply the truth arriving, and the truth did not need blocking or staging. The room did not understand immediately, which gave Amara approximately 4 seconds of confusion before understanding hit her, and those 4 seconds were visible on her face in a way that the photographer, who had been specifically briefed, captured in exquisite detail. Then Amara's champagne flute came down on the table too hard, and she stood up, and her chair scraped back, and she looked at her sister across the candlelit room with an expression that had run out of performances entirely, just her face, stripped of everything she had constructed over the past weeks. And what was underneath was not what anyone expected. It was not defiance, it was not cunning, it was something that looked, briefly and terribly, like relief, as though some exhausting thing had finally been allowed to stop. Then she ran. She made it 4 steps toward the exit before Douglas's colleagues were simply there. Not dramatically, not roughly, just present in the way that certain problems are simply resolved, and Amara stopped, because there was nowhere the steps were going to take her that was going to be better than where she was standing. Kwame did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He stood at the head of the table and addressed his guests with the measured clarity of a man giving a business presentation, which was, his lawyer had suggested, exactly the right register for this particular occasion, and he explained from the beginning what had happened, the visa, the identity theft, the fraud complaint, the investigation, the 2 weeks of monitoring a woman pretend to be her sister over eggs and casual conversation, and he did it without drama, without embellishment, and without looking at Amara once, which was more devastating than anything else he could have done. The room was very quiet. 12 people with champagne flutes they had stopped drinking from, listening to a story that was so precise in its wrongness that none of them had a social script for what expression to arrange their faces into, so they simply kept them still. When he finished, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed an envelope on the table in front of Amara. Not slid, placed with 2 fingers, the way you set something down that you want to make sure stays exactly where you put it. "That is a deportation notice," he said, "processed in cooperation with the Home Office, effective tonight." Amara looked at it. She did not pick it up. "I had it prepared 3 weeks ago," Kwame added, with the mildest possible tone. "I just wanted to make sure I had everything correct before I used it." 2 of Douglas's colleagues moved to stand beside Amara with the practiced neutrality of professionals, and she looked at them, and then at Zola, and for one long, airless moment the 2 sisters looked at each other across the restaurant, and everything that had ever lived between them, the shared childhood, the borrowed moisturizer, the drugged tea, the stolen earrings, the 4 visa applications, the 5-year plan dismantled in one night, all of it compressed into that look, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing in language that was sized correctly for what the look already contained. Then Amara lifted her chin, which was the last performance she had left, and walked out between Douglas's colleagues with her white gown and her borrowed earrings, and the specific dignity of someone who has run completely out of options and has decided that posture is the only currency remaining. The door closed. The room exhaled. Someone refilled a champagne glass, more out of a need to do something with their hands than out of celebration, and a quiet conversation slowly restarted at the far end of the table, and Kwame walked across the restaurant to where Zola was still standing near the door, because she had not moved since she walked in, as if she had used everything she had just to get here and had nothing remaining for the next step. "Sit down," he said, gently, not as a command but as an offering, and she sat, and he sat across from her, and for a moment they were just 2 people at a table in a restaurant that had had an exceptionally unusual evening. Zola put her folder of documents on the table between them. It was very organized. Nality had always been thorough. "You brought your paperwork," Kwame observed. "I wasn't sure what the protocol was," she said, which was the first genuinely funny thing either of them had said all evening, and they both recognized it at the same time, and something in the room loosened slightly. He looked at her for a moment with the same quality of attention he had given her file photograph 3 weeks ago, the direct eyes, the face that did not perform. "The original sponsorship offer," he said. "It was restored to your name 6 days ago, all documentation corrected, the fraud flag removed. The Home Office has been fully briefed. Your employment record has been cleared." He paused, in the way of a man who chooses his next words carefully, not because he is uncertain, but because the words matter. I would like to ask if you are still interested in accepting it. Zola looked at the table. She looked at her folder. She looked at the green dress her mother had pressed the night before, and the earrings that were hers and had always been hers, and the hands in her lap that had spent 10 years checking blood pressure and straightening pillows and mixing rooibos tea to exact specifications at 2 a.m. for patients who needed someone to care whether the tea was right. She was quiet for long enough that Kwame did not fill the silence, which told her something about him. Yes, she said, finally, simply, the same way she had read that approval email 6 times before she believed it, something that started small and became real only in the saying of it. Amara Dlamini landed back in Cape Town on a Monday morning in the white silk gown she had been wearing when she left the restaurant, because no one had offered her a change of clothes, which was its own kind of commentary, and she walked through Ortambo International with her arms folded against the autumn cold and her face arranged in the expression she had worn out of the restaurant, chin up, posture intact, because she had nothing else. There were 2 officers waiting for her at the arrivals gate, which she had half expected, and beside them was a woman from the National Prosecuting Authority with a file under her arm and the brisk energy of someone with a full calendar, and Amara was informed, with professional courtesy, that she was being charged with identity fraud, document theft, and obtaining travel authorization by deception, and that she had the right to legal representation, which she was going to need, because Nality had been very thorough. Mama Grace did not come to the airport. Zola had called her from London the night before, and Mama Grace had listened to the whole story without saying much, and at the end she had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "I will pray for her," which was both the kindest and the most devastating thing she could have said, because it was the response you give when someone has gone so far from who they were supposed to be that ordinary emotion is no longer adequate. 3 weeks later, Zola Dlamini walked into St. Catherine's Private Hospital in East London at 6:45 a.m. in a white nursing uniform, with a stethoscope around her neck and her ID badge clipped to her lapel, and the ward sister who met her at the nurse's station shook her hand and said, "We have heard good things," and Zola said, "I hope to earn them," which was exactly the right answer and also exactly true. She walked down the corridor with the particular pace of someone who knows what a hospital corridor requires, purposeful but not rushed, eyes moving, hands already thinking about what they would need to do next. And at the far end of the hallway a morning shift was beginning, the particular organized hum of a place where people came to be put back together, and it was the most familiar sound in the world. She paused at the end of the hallway, just for a moment, and looked back the way she had come, all the way back, past the ward entrance and the London morning pressing through the windows, and the Atlantic Ocean, and the Cape Town winter, and her mother's kitchen, and the 4 rejection letters, and the 5th approval, and the drugged tea, and the stolen earrings, and the couch at Mama Grace's house and Nality tapping her pen on her desk, and the green dress, and the restaurant and Kwame saying, "Sit down," gently like an offering. All of it. Then she turned back to the ward, because there was a patient in bed 3 who needed someone, and she was, after everything, still exactly who she had always been. "She thought she was stealing my future," she said quietly, to no one in the hallway. She was only delaying it. Then she got to work. The end.